They say the West remembers its storms, not the ones that tear through the sky, but the kind that tear through a man's soul. One winter night, a former sheriff named Eli Harrow opened his door to a half-drowned woman whispering, "They beat me." By dawn, nothing in Silverton Hollow would ever be the same. Who was she, this woman, running barefoot through the rain, with fear in her eyes and courage in her heart? Why did the man who once carried the law now hide from it? And when truth and vengeance finally met in the middle of that dusty street, which one would survive? This is not a tale about heroes and villains. It's about the thin line between them, about guilt, mercy, and the price of doing what's right when the world says it's wrong. It's about a light that kept burning in the dark long after the gunfire stopped. So, lean close to the fire. Friend, click like, share this story, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes. Because tonight, we ride back to Silverton Hollow, where redemption didn't roar. It whispered. The wind moved across the land like an old soul that had forgotten where to rest. It slid through the sagebrush, whistled through the dry grass, and carried the scent of dust and pine down from the hills. Eli Harrow paused mid-swing with his hammer, leaning one arm against the weathered fence post. He looked out over the 160 acres of land he called his own, if anyone could truly call this wild country theirs. The sun sat low behind a veil of thin gray clouds, spilling a faint light across the open field. Winter was coming early. He could feel it in his bones, that deep ache that settled into every joint when the air began to bite. The hammer in his hand felt heavier than it should have. He exhaled, slow and steady, and listened to the land breathe around him. A coyote called somewhere to the north, its lonely cry stretching across the valley. Eli lifted his head to it. A quiet acknowledgement. He understood the sound, the need to speak, even when no one answered. He finished the fence post, hammered the last nail, and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. The air tasted like cold metal. He glanced at the horizon. Dark clouds were stacking over the distant mesas, rolling slow and deliberate. Storm coming. The kind that brought lightning sharp enough to split a tree, and wind that made the tin roof sing like a sad fiddle. Bramble, his old sorrel gelding, stood a few yards away, tail swishing lazily, waiting for him. Eli gave the horse a nod, the kind of quiet gesture between two creatures that had seen too many years together to need words. He gathered his tools, packed them in the saddlebag, and mounted up. The fence line stretched out in both directions, disappearing into a land too big for any man to fill. He rode slow, one hand resting on the horn, eyes scanning the ground for breaks in the wire. Wind tugged at his coat. Dust lifted in faint spirals from Bramble's hooves. It was the same ride he took every evening, not because the fence needed fixing, but because he couldn't stand to sit still inside four walls too long. He used to ride for a different reason once. Back when he wore a tin star on his chest and people called him Sheriff Harrow. Back when the world made a kind of sense law on one side, wrong on the other. That was before the night everything went sideways, before the shouting, the flash of a gun, and a boy, just a boy, fell into the dirt because Eli's hand had been too fast. He'd handed in his badge the next morning, didn't wait for thanks, didn't wait for forgiveness. He just rode west until the towns grew smaller and the memories quieter. Silverton Hollow was the last place the road led him. Tucked between scrubland and sky, 12 miles from anywhere that mattered. Now, it was all he had left, that, and the silence he'd built around himself like a wall. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was nothing but a pale bruise behind the clouds. He swung down, unsaddled Bramble, brushed the horse's neck. "Good enough for today," he muttered, voice rough from disuse. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee gone stale. He lit the lamp, its yellow glow chasing the shadows to the corners. The room was simple: bed, stove, table, chair, everything he needed and nothing he didn't. He poured himself a cup from the pot still sitting on the stove, winced at the bitterness, and sat by the window. From here he could see the stretch of open land fading into the distance. The wind picked up again, and somewhere far off, thunder murmured. He told himself he liked it this way: the quiet, the distance, no deputies, no drunks, no questions, just the rhythm of work, the whisper of the wind, and the company of things that didn't ask for more than he could give. But sometimes, when the night pressed too close, the silence felt less like peace and more like punishment. He reached for the small wooden box on the table, the one he rarely opened. Inside lay his old badge, tarnished and cold. He ran a thumb over the star's edges, tracing the places where the shine had worn away. For a long moment, he just sat there, the weight of it resting heavy in his palm. Then he set it back, closed the lid, and pushed the box away. Rain began to fall, light at first, a scatter of drops against the window, then harder, steadier, until the roof started to hum with it. Eli rose, fed another log to the stove, and listened to the hiss and crack of the fire. He could feel the air shift, the kind of pressure that came before lightning. A flash lit the sky, painting the world in quick silver, followed by a low growl that rolled through the earth. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit him like a slap. Rain beaded on his coat, dripped from the brim of his hat. The land stretched out before him wide, dark, alive. It was beautiful, and it was empty. He breathed in the scent of wet dirt and sage. A part of him wanted to believe the storm might wash something clean inside him, but guilt wasn't mud. It didn't rinse away easy. Lightning cracked again, closer this time. He could see it for an instant, the fence line glinting white in the flash. Bramble's silhouette shifting in the pen, the vast horizon trembling under the storm's hand. Then came the thunder, deep and rolling, shaking the porch boards beneath his boots. Eli Harrow stood there, unmoving, eyes fixed on the dark, beyond the fence. It felt like the land was breathing with him, slow, heavy, restless. He didn't know it yet, but before the next sunrise, that same wind would carry a stranger to his door, and everything he'd buried out here in the quiet would start to wake again. The storm came down hard after sundown. Rain swept across the plains in sheets, drumming on the tin roof like 1,000 fists. Lightning tore through the sky, lighting the horizon for a heartbeat at a time. Each flash showed the world in silver and shadow fence posts, slick mud, the lonely outline of Eli Harrow's cabin standing against the night. Inside, the fire hissed each time the wind forced its way down the chimney. Eli sat at the table, boots off, coffee cooling between his hands. He was listening to the storm the way some men listen to sermons, quiet, resigned, waiting for it to finish telling its truth. Then he heard it. At first, it was nothing more than a trick of the wind, a broken note in the howl. He frowned, leaned his head, and waited. Another gust rattled the shutters. Then, faint and thin as breath, it came again. A voice. "Please, help me." Eli stood up so fast the chair scraped across the floor. For a second he thought he'd imagined it. But the storm carried the sound once more. Closer this time, a cry lost between thunderclaps. Instinct moved before thought did. He grabbed his coat, his lantern, and pulled open the door. Rain slapped him in the face, cold and hard. He lifted the lantern high. The light reached only a few yards before dissolving into the downpour. "Hello," he called. No answer, just wind, roaring in the cottonwoods by the creek. He was about to turn back when movement caught his eye. Someone staggered out of the darkness, half crawling, half falling toward the porch. The lantern flame flickered across a woman's face, pale and wild-eyed. She was barefoot, soaked to the bone, her dress torn and clinging to her like second skin. She lifted her head just enough to meet his eyes. "They beat me," she gasped. "I'm dying." Then she collapsed. For one breath. Eli froze. Every muscle in his body screamed to shut the door, to let the storm take her, to stay out of whatever trouble followed that voice. He'd promised himself he'd never open his life to anyone again. Never. But the old part of him, the lawman that had refused to look away from suffering, stirred like an echo of thunder. He cursed under his breath and bent down. The woman was light in his arms, light in the way broken things are. Her skin burned with fever, even in the cold rain. He carried her inside, the lantern swinging, shadows twisting along the walls. The door slammed shut behind them, as if the wind meant to keep them in. He laid her on the rug near the stove, close enough for the heat to reach her, but not burn. Water dripped from her hair, pooling dark circles on the floorboards. She was breathing, but shallow, each breath a fight. Eli fetched a blanket, then another. His hands, large and scarred, moved awkwardly as he wrapped her. He hadn't touched another soul in years. Not like this, not in care. Her right arm was bruised from wrist to shoulder, skin cut open near the elbow. He poured whiskey on a cloth and dabbed it clean. She flinched so hard it made him stop. "It's all right," he murmured, voice low, rough with rust. "You're safe here." He didn't even believe it yet, but saying it made it feel almost true. Her eyes fluttered open for a heartbeat, gray, cloudy, filled with a fear so deep it seemed to swallow the light. She looked at him, then at the rifle leaning by the door, and tried to push herself back. Don't hurt me," she whispered. Eli held up both hands, palms out. "No one's gonna hurt you." He kept his distance, waited until the tremor in her breathing eased. Her body went slack again, surrendering to exhaustion. The storm outside raged on, beating the walls, shaking the windows. Inside, the only sounds were the fire's low crackle and the rasp of her breathing. Eli sat down on the floor beside her, back to the wall, the lantern casting soft gold across her face. She couldn't have been more than 30, too young to look that haunted. He studied the marks on her wrists, rope burns, deep and angry. Whoever she'd run from hadn't meant to let her go. He felt anger rise in him, slow and dangerous, the kind that made a man's hands tighten without thinking. He forced a breath through his teeth and looked away. He needed to think, but the room was full of questions, and none of them had answers. Who was she? Where had she come from, and who would come looking for her before dawn? He stood, poured water into a pot, set it on the stove to warm. While it heated, he took one of his shirts from the chest and draped it over a chair near the fire to dry. Her clothes were little more than rags, soaked and torn. He turned away, giving her what privacy he could. Lightning flashed again, bright enough to fill the cabin with white light. In that brief moment, Eli saw his reflection in the window, gaunt, tired, older than his 46 years. And behind that reflection, the image of her, small and fragile, on the floor, wrapped in his mother's old quilt. The storm outside couldn't drown the storm that rose inside him. He knelt beside her once more, touched the edge of the blanket. Her pulse fluttered under his fingers, weak, but there. He whispered, mostly to himself, "You'll be all right. You hear me? You made it this far." The woman didn't answer, but her breathing steadied just enough to make him believe she might live through the night. Eli sat there until the fire burned low. Rain softened to a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat against the roof. He rubbed a hand over his face and let out a long, weary sigh. He had no idea what kind of trouble had just landed on his porch. But trouble had a way of finding men like him, men trying too hard to live quiet. He looked at her again, at the bruises, the dirt under her nails, the faint cut on her temple. Whatever road had brought her here, it had nearly killed her. He reached for another log, fed it to the stove, and spoke aloud, voice breaking from disuse. "You're safe here." The words hung in the warm air, thin but steady, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but one he'd die trying to honor. The storm eased toward dawn, trading its fury for a low, steady rain that whispered against the windows. Eli Harrow hadn't slept. He sat beside the stove, lantern burning low, eyes fixed on the woman who'd fallen through his door the night before. She lay wrapped in quilts near the fire, her breathing shallow but steady. Every so often, a tremor passed through her, like her body was still outrunning whatever had chased her here. Eli's hands rested on his knees, fingers laced tight to keep from shaking. He told himself he should have ridden for the sheriff hours ago, that it wasn't his problem. But the truth was, he couldn't leave her not like this. When the first light crept through the cracks in the shutters, he rose. His knees popped. The air inside the cabin smelled of damp wool, ash, and whiskey. He fetched the old supply chest from under his cot, the one he hadn't opened in years. Inside a few bandages, a bottle of carbolic, some old cloth strips yellowed with age. He poured whiskey into a tin cup, tore a length of bandage, and crouched beside her. "Easy," he said, mostly out of habit. The sound of his own voice startled him. He hadn't used it much lately. When the cloth touched her skin, she jerked awake, gasped, tried to pull away. Her eyes were wild, unfocused. "Don't," she whispered, the words sharp with fear. Eli froze. He lifted his hands, palms out. "It's just whiskey," he said softly. "For cleaning. That's all." For a moment she didn't move. Then her gaze focused on him, on the gray stubble, the tired eyes, the rough hands holding nothing but cloth and worry. Something in her expression loosened, like a knot slowly giving way. She nodded once, wordless permission. He worked carefully. The bruises along her arms were dark, almost black in places. He recognized the shape of a boot print near her ribs. Anger tightened in his chest, but he kept it hidden. He'd seen men like the ones who did this, men who mistook strength for ownership. He swore under his breath, low enough that she couldn't hear. She flinched again when he cleaned the cut near her temple. "Sorry," he murmured. Her lips moved, but the words barely came out. "It's not you I'm afraid of." He paused, cloth still in his hand. Something about the way she said it soft, resigned, struck him deep. He wanted to ask who she meant, what she'd been running from, but he didn't. Questions could wait. For now, survival came first. He wrapped her wounds, tied each knot gentle and sure. When he finished, He sat back on his heels, staring at the hands that had done the work. They were scarred, cracked from years of labor. He thought about how long it had been since they'd done anything kind. When did these hands forget softness? They'd once held a badge, a gun, a man bleeding out on a dirt street. They'd built fences, broken colts, mended roofs, always fixing, never comforting. Now they shook slightly, as if remembering what it felt like to matter to another human being. She stirred under the blanket, eyelids fluttering. "Water," she whispered. He poured from the kettle, held the cup to her lips. She drank a little, then sank back, exhausted. "Thank you," she murmured. The words were faint but clear. Eli nodded, unsure how to answer. He wasn't used to thanks. He hesitated, then crossed the cabin to the chest at the foot of his cot. From inside, he pulled out an old wool blanket, soft, faded blue. His mother's. He hadn't unfolded it in years. It still smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. He laid it gently over her shoulders. For a second, his fingers brushed her hair, damp strands like silk, against his calloused skin. He pulled back quickly, embarrassed by the tenderness of the gesture. Still, he saw her lips move in a half-smile before sleep claimed her again. He settled onto the stool beside the stove. Outside, the rain whispered its endless rhythm, a sound that filled the quiet places between breaths. Inside, the fire cast long shadows across the walls, the kind that moved like memories. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes on the flame. He'd told himself he wanted nothing from the world anymore. No company, no cause, no ghosts. But the sight of her lying there broke something open in him. He could feel the old instincts, the urge to protect, to make things right, stirring where he'd buried them deep. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm the ache that had settled in them. The skin was cracked, stained with dirt and years, hands made for work, not mercy. He flexed his fingers, listening to the creak of the joints. They looked foreign to him, like they belonged to a man he no longer knew. Repair and mend. He whispered to the fire. "That's all I do now," but he didn't quite believe it. Hours passed. The storm thinned to a drizzle, the gray of morning seeping through the windows. Mara, he didn't know her name yet, but somehow it fit, slept without stirring. Eli kept watch, eyes heavy but unwilling to close. Every sound made him glance toward the door, the crack of thunder far away, the sigh of wind through the cracks, the old boards settling under the weight of rain. He waited for footsteps that didn't come, for voices that didn't shout her name. Nothing but quiet. For now. He rose finally, stretched, poured himself a bit of coffee, gone cold. The bitterness sat sharp on his tongue. He looked down at the woman sleeping near his hearth, the blue blanket tucked under her chin. In the soft light, she looked younger, almost peaceful. He turned away, jaw tightening. "This ain't your fight," he muttered to himself. "Let the law handle it." But even as he said it, he knew he was lying. He'd told himself that same thing once before the night he'd walked away from the badge. And still, that boy had died in his hands. He looked at his rifle by the door, then at her again. The space between them felt heavy, with something unspoken, not attraction, not pity, just recognition. Two people the world had beaten in different ways, both still standing. He sat back down, the firelight flickering across his tired face. Outside, the rain slowed to a soft patter, almost kind. Inside, he whispered. The words meant only for himself, rough and low. "Not again. Don't get involved." But he already was. The storm had spent itself by morning. A thin mist hung over the land, softening the world into shades of gray and silver. From the cabin porch, the fields looked washed clean, every blade of grass heavy with rain, the soil dark as ink. Inside, Eli Harrow poured water into a dented kettle and set it on the stove. Behind him, the woman stirred. He turned in time to see her flinch awake, eyes wide, trying to make sense of where she was. Her hand went instinctively to her side, as if she expected to find pain waiting there. When her fingers brushed the bandages, her shoulders loosened only slightly. "You're safe," Eli said quietly. The words sounded rough, like they'd scraped their way out of him. She looked at him for a long second before answering. "Where am I? Outside Silverton Hollow," he said. "About 12 miles west." She blinked, the name meaning nothing to her yet. Her voice was hoarse when she asked, "How long was I asleep?" "Most of the night," Eli replied. He poured her a cup of water, held it out. She hesitated, then took it with both hands, sipping like someone afraid of taking too much. When she finished, she managed to whisper, "You found me?" "No," he said, setting the cup aside. "You found me?" For a moment, neither spoke. Only the crackle of the fire filled the space between them. Her gaze wandered the room, the plain wooden walls, the rifle by the door, the coffee pot on the stove. Everything simple, everything worn. The kind of place that could be safe or dangerous, depending on the man inside it. "I remember the rain," she murmured, "and the light from your window." She closed her eyes, as if seeing it again. "I didn't think I'd make it this far." "You nearly didn't," Eli said. He waited, giving her time. He'd questioned enough frightened people in his life to know that silence could be kinder than pushing. After a long moment, she drew the blanket tighter around herself. "My name's Mara Ellison," she said finally. "I was traveling east from Tucson. I'd been offered work." Eli nodded, but she could see the question in his eyes. "What kind of work?" She gave a small, bitter laugh. "That's what I asked too." Her fingers twisted the edge of the quilt as she spoke. "There was a man named Silas Boone. He ran a freight line wagons, supplies, cattle drives. He said he needed someone to teach the children of his crew. Said they'd built a camp out by the Rio Mora. Wanted a woman with schooling to civilize the men." Eli's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Smooth talkers with clean hands who did their worst behind closed doors. "I was tired," she went on. "Tired of waiting tables in dust towns. Tired of being called girl when I was past 30. He promised wages, passage, a place to sleep. I thought I'd finally found a bit of peace." She stopped, staring at the fire. Her next words came slower, harder. "They took my things the first night. Said it was for safekeeping. Then my shoes. Then my name." Eli's fingers tightened around his coffee cup until his knuckles whitened. He didn't interrupt. She kept talking quietly, almost detached, like someone telling a story that didn't belong to them anymore. "They said I owed them for the food, for the wagon ride, for every breath I took. When I asked to leave," Boone laughed. "He said I could go once my debt was paid, but every sunrise, the debt got higher." Her voice cracked. "They made me cook, clean, haul water till my hands bled. When I refused one of them..." She stopped. The silence that followed was thick, choking. Outside, a single drop of water slid down the window pane, long and slow. Eli didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at the fire, jaw locked, the muscles in his forearm twitching. He'd known men like that seen their kind swagger into courtrooms and walk out free. Once, he'd tried to stop one. The law hadn't helped then either. Mara took a shuddering breath. "One night, I waited till they were drunk. I ran. I don't even know how far I went. There was a river deep, fast. I thought I'd drown, but the water carried me instead. When I climbed out, I saw your light through the rain. Her hands shook now, the memory working its way out of her bones. Eli set his cup down, slow and careful. He didn't trust his voice yet. He said I was property, she whispered, almost to herself. The words hung in the air, small but heavy as stone. Eli looked up. His eyes found hers across the dim light of the room. For the first time, his voice came steady, low, and certain. You're not. It was 2 words, but they hit like thunder, rolling through the valley. Something changed in the room. Not the air, not the fire, but the space between them. A man who'd stopped believing in redemption had just made himself a promise. Mara turned her face away, eyes glistening. He didn't reach for her, didn't need to. The silence between them said what neither could, that what had been taken might still be returned, piece by piece, by someone who refused to walk away this time. Eli rose, crossed to the stove, and poured her a cup of coffee. He handed it to her, careful not to touch her hand. Drink, you'll need strength. She managed a small nod. Outside, the clouds began to break apart, thin lines of sunlight threading through the mist. A bird called once from the ridge. The day was trying to start again, as if the world didn't know what had happened in the dark. Eli leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching her. His chest felt tight, but not from anger alone. Something else had taken root there, quiet, stubborn, familiar. A vow. Unspoken, but certain. He didn't know what he'd do yet, or how far he'd go. But one thing had already settled deep inside him. He wasn't going to let Silas Boone own another soul, not while he was still breathing. Night came slow that evening, the kind of slow that feels like it's waiting for something to break. The air inside the cabin was heavy with the smell of stew beef, onions, and a little salt pork Eli had saved for winter. The pot simmered quietly over the fire, hissing now and then like it was whispering secrets. Outside, the wind had calmed, the rain was gone, the world, for a few fragile hours, seemed at peace. Mara sat at the table, wrapped still in the blue blanket. Color had begun to return to her cheeks. Her hands, though, stayed close to her chest, like she wasn't sure they still belonged to her. Eli ladled stew into 2 tin bowls, set one in front of her, and sat down across the table. The firelight caught in the lines on his face, softened them somehow. She looked at the bowl for a long moment before picking up the spoon. When she tasted it, she closed her eyes. It was such a small thing, a person eating after fear, but Eli felt something shift in the room. He looked away, pretending to check the fire, pretending not to care whether she liked it or not. "It's good," she said finally. He nodded. "It'll do." The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the low pop of the burning wood. When she finished, she leaned back a little, staring into the flames. After a while, she said softly, "Thank you for saving me." Eli's hand paused halfway to his mouth. He lowered the spoon, eyes fixed on the fire. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "You'd have done the same?" She shook her head. "No, not everyone would." He didn't answer. He didn't like praise. It never fit right. He reached for the pot, poured a bit more stew into his bowl, not because he was hungry, but to fill the quiet. Outside, the wind sighed through the eaves, a long, low sound like an old song half remembered. Inside, The fire crackled, throwing shadows across the cabin walls. Mara's eyes followed the flickering light. "It's strange," she said quietly. "How something can burn and still be beautiful." Eli looked up. She wasn't talking about the fire. He knew that tone, the voice of someone remembering pain too deep for words. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only kindness left. He stood, took the empty bowls, rinsed them with a little water, and set them aside. When he turned back, Mara was still staring into the flames. Her face was calm now, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She caught him watching, managed a faint smile. "I keep thinking," she said, "about the river, about how cold it was. I thought I was gone. I thought that was it." She looked up at him. "Then I saw your light." Eli shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "I didn't know it'd matter." He said, "That lamp." "It did." She said, "It still does." He turned back to the fire, jaw tightening. Her words stirred something he'd spent years trying to bury, the idea that maybe his presence in this world could still mean something good. But the thought scared him more than it comforted. He'd made peace with being alone. Peace was easier than hope. When the silence stretched too long, he went to the shelf, took down a bottle of whiskey, and poured a small shot into a tin cup. He hesitated before setting it in front of her. "For the pain?" he said. She looked at the cup, then at him. "Will it help?" He shrugged. "Can't hurt." She took a sip, winced, then laughed, a sound so sudden and soft that it startled him. "I'd forgotten what laughter felt like," she said. Eli half smiled, the ghost of one anyway. "Hurts less when you use it now and then," he said. They sat like that for a while, two people stitched together by silence and firelight. When the last log burned low, he stood and fed another into the stove. The glow flared, bright and alive again. Then came the question he'd been circling all night. "What are you planning to do?" he asked quietly. Her face went still. "I don't know," she said. "If I go back, he'll kill me. If I stay here, he'll find me." Eli nodded, eyes on the fire. He could hear the echo of lawmen he'd once known, voices telling him the right thing to do: ride her to town, turn her over to the sheriff, let the law handle it. He almost said it aloud, but the words stuck in his throat, because the law wasn't what it used to be. And in his hands, once upon a time, the law had broken and taken a life it was meant to protect. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough scrape of stubble against his palm. "The law broke once through my hand," he muttered. "Can I trust it again?" Mara didn't answer. She didn't have to. The fire popped, a single spark leaping out and dying on the floor. He turned to her. Her eyes met his, tired but steady. Something passed between them, not a plea, not even a request, just the quiet understanding of two souls who'd both run out of safe places. Eli straightened, his voice rough. "If they come for you," he said, "they'll have to come through me." For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she whispered, almost like a prayer, "Then they will." He didn't flinch at the warning. He just nodded once, slow and certain. The firelight danced across his face, catching in his eyes, not anger this time, but something deeper. Conviction. Outside, the night wind began to rise again, brushing against the cabin like a whisper of what was coming. He looked toward the door, hand instinctively brushing the rifle by the frame. He didn't know it yet, but that quiet promise he'd just made had already set the whole world turning toward him. For the first time in years, Eli Harrow didn't feel like a man hiding from his past. He felt like a man waiting for it. By the time Eli and Mara reached the edge of town, the morning sun was already high and merciless. The dirt road shimmered with heat, stretching ahead like a trial they hadn't chosen to walk. Silverton Hollow wasn't much a single street of weathered buildings and people who liked to know everyone else's business. And right now, everyone's business was riding in on Eli Harrow's wagon. The old horse, Bramble, clopped slow and steady down the rutted street. Dust rose around the wheels in lazy spirals. Eli sat tall, hat pulled low, eyes scanning every face that turned toward them. Mara sat beside him, wrapped in a shawl, her expression fixed somewhere between fear and defiance. The blacksmith paused mid-swing. The saloon doors flapped once and stilled. A woman sweeping her porch froze, broom in hand. Whispers followed them like the tail of a storm. Eli could hear snatches of it. "That's Harrow. Who's the woman trouble? Sure as sunrise." They stopped outside the sheriff's office. The building leaned a little to the left, like it had given up on standing proud. A weather-beaten sign above the door read, "Tom Greeley, Sheriff." Eli tied Bramble to the post and helped Mara down. She looked pale, but steady. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "He has to be stopped. Inside." The air smelled of stale tobacco and dust. Sheriff Tom Greeley looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face before it hardened into something else, something cautious. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Didn't think I'd see you again, Harrow." Eli took off his hat. "Morning. Tom, it's been, what, 5 years, 6? Greeley leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Last I heard, you were fixing fences and avoiding people. Now here you are, walking right into my office with a woman folks say came out of the river like a ghost. Mind telling me what this is about?" Eli glanced at Mara. She stood a few feet back, hands clasped tight in front of her, as if bracing for judgment. "This is Mara Ellison," Eli said. "She was held against her will by a man named Silas Boone. She escaped his camp near the Rio Mora. She wants to press charges." Greeley's brow furrowed. "Silas Boone," he repeated slowly. "Now there's a name that keeps my town alive." He gestured toward the window with his cigar. "Half the freight wagons parked out there belong to him. He's got contracts with the mine, the mill, even the church. You sure you want to tangle with that kind of man?" "I don't tangle." Eli said, "I tell the truth." The sheriff sighed, set the cigar aside. He looked at Mara. "Miss Ellison, is this true? You're saying Boone held you against your will, yes?" she said, her voice low but firm. "He said I was property. He made me work until I collapsed." Her words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Greeley rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Eli," he said finally, "you know how this looks, don't you? A man with your past showing up out of nowhere, bringing in a woman no one's seen before, accusing one of the most powerful men in the county." Eli's jaw tightened. "You think I'd lie about something like this? I think you don't understand how thin the ground is under your boots," Greeley replied. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from balancing the truth against the cost of speaking it. "You want justice, Eli, or revenge?" Eli's eyes were steady. At this point, he said, "I don't see the difference." Before Greeley could answer, the door swung open. Sunlight poured in around a tall man in a fine vest and a hat too clean for this town, Silas Boone. He walked in like he owned the place, and maybe, in a way, he did. "Sheriff," Boone said with a smile that never touched his eyes. "I heard rumors you had company. Thought I'd come clear a few things up." Greeley stood. "Afternoon, Boone." Eli didn't move. Mira froze, color draining from her face. Boone tipped his hat toward her. "Well now," he drawled. "If it isn't my runaway school teacher. You had us worried sick, Miss Ellison. Vanished in the middle of the night. Took off with some of our supplies, too." "That's a lie," Mara snapped. Boone chuckled. "Now, sweetheart, we both know memory's a funny thing after a fever." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "Sheriff, here's the contract she signed. Got her mark right here agreeing to work in exchange for transport and provisions." He spread it on the desk. "I was." The paper was neat, official looking, stamped and dated. Eli didn't have to touch it to know it was a forgery. The ink was too clean, the language too polished for a freight man's hand. Greeley scanned it, frowning. "This looks legal enough." Eli stepped forward. You believe that Boone smiled, eyes gleaming. "Believe it, Sheriff. I wrote it." For a moment, no one spoke. Outside, a wagon wheel creaked. A dog barked in the distance. The air inside the office felt thick as molasses. Mara broke the silence. "He's lying." Boone turned to her, voice soft, almost gentle. "Now, Miss Ellison, we can do this easy or hard. You come with me quiet, finish your term, and I'll forgive the debt. You keep running your mouth, and I'll have to let the law decide how much trouble you're really in." Eli's hand drifted near his belt, not to draw, but because every muscle in his body screamed for it. Boone noticed, smirked, and spread his hands. "Easy. Harrow. You're not the law anymore, remember." The sheriff stepped between them, palm raised. "Enough, both of you." He looked from Boone to Eli, then to Mara. "This is a legal matter. I'll send a wire to Santa Fe, get proper papers. Until then, nobody makes a move. You understand?" Boone nodded, still smiling. "Of course, Sheriff. I wouldn't dream of breaking the law." He tipped his hat again, eyes flicking toward Mara. "Don't wander far, sweetheart. Wouldn't want you getting lost again." When he was gone, the silence felt colder than before. Eli turned on Greeley. "You saw her bruises." "Tom." "I did." "You heard what he said." "I did." "Then do something." Greeley met his eyes, the weight of the town pressing behind him. "I will," he said quietly. "But you need to understand, truth don't carry as far as money does in this place." Eli looked at him a long time. "Then maybe it's time someone made it louder." He took his hat, placed it on his head, and walked out without another word. Mara followed, her steps unsteady but determined. Behind them, the sheriff's window rattled in the hot wind. Out on Silverton's dusty main street, the townsfolk stared again, whispering not about pity this time, but about a storm they could feel gathering. And though the sun still burned over Silverton Hollow, the shadows had begun to move. By noon, the whole town had heard. Silverton Hollow thrived on gossip the way the desert thrived on sun. It burned everything it touched. When Eli Harrow stepped out of the boarding house that morning, he could feel the eyes, from behind curtains, from porches, from men leaning against hitching rails, pretending to whittle while their mouths whispered his name. Mara walked beside him, shawl pulled tight, chin high. She wouldn't look at the faces, wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Eli led her toward the sheriff's office again. He'd barely slept. Neither had she. They'd spent the night waiting for justice to remember its purpose. Sheriff Tom Greeley stood by the door when they arrived, hands on his belt, expression already weary. "Boone's inside," he said quietly. "Brought witnesses? Says he's got proof you're lying." Eli felt his jaw tighten. "Proof?" Greeley nodded. "A lockbox. Claims you stole it." Mara's face went pale. I know, the sheriff said. But he's got half the town believing otherwise. You sure you want to walk into that? Eli glanced toward the crowd, gathering outside, men, women, a few boys leaning against fence posts, all pretending to mind their business, all waiting for a show. He looked back at Greeley. We're already in it. The office was cramped and hot. Boone stood near the desk, polished as ever, clean shirt, gold watch chain glinting against his vest, smile sharp as a knife's edge. Beside him were two of his men, Jed Cutter, all muscle and malice, and a thin bookkeeper type holding papers like scripture. Boone tipped his hat as they entered. Well now, he said easily, the hero returns. And with the lady herself, good, saves me the trouble of hunting you down. Miss Ellison. Mara stiffened. Eli didn't respond, just closed the door behind them. The murmur of the crowd outside became a dull hum through the walls. Let's get to it, Greeley said, moving behind his desk. Boone, you said you've got evidence. Indeed I do. Boone said. He gestured to the bookkeeper, who stepped forward with the box, small, iron, scuffed at the corners. This here was found missing from my supply wagon the same night Miss Ellison ran off. Inside was cash, silver, company papers, all gone. She stole it to fund her escape. That's a lie, Mara said, voice trembling but steady. I left with nothing. I barely made it out alive. Boone clucked his tongue. But your word against mine, sweetheart, and mine carries weight here. He turned to the sheriff, lowering his voice just enough for the room to lean closer. You know how it is. Tom, we men work hard out here, sweat, bleed, build, and along comes a pretty face-crying victim. It's an old story. And the older I get, the more I see how often it's us paying the price for kindness. A few chuckles drifted in from the open window. Eli's stomach twisted. He could see the manipulation working the charm, the tone of wounded decency. Boone didn't need to be right. He just needed to sound reasonable. Sheriff, Boone continued, you've seen the contract, clear as day. She signed on for a year of service. The fact she ran off, took money, and spun this tale well. That's fraud. I'm a patient man, but I can't stand by while my good name's dragged through the mud. Eli stepped forward, voice low but dangerous. You don't have a good name, Boone. You've got a racket built on pain and lies. Boone smiled thinly, still quicker, with words, then with proof. I see. He turned back to Greeley. If you'd be so kind as to open the box. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. The latch creaked as he lifted the lid. Inside lay neat stacks of paper, a few coins, and at the top a folded letter with a woman's handwriting. Boone reached in, unfolded it with a flourish. I took the liberty of bringing her confession, he said, signed by Miss Ellison herself. Mara's mouth opened in disbelief. That's not mine, Boone held it out, smug. See the mark? Same hand that signed the contract. Greeley looked between them, his brow furrowed, his conscience wrestling with the evidence in his hand. Eli, he said slowly, these look legitimate. They're not, Eli growled. Boone's eyes gleamed. Ah, but legitimacy, my friend, is what a man can afford to print. The crowd outside was pressing closer now. Faces at the window, whispers swelling. Boone says she stole from him. Didn't he bring the papers? Can't fight money with talk? Eli could feel the walls closing in. He'd seen this kind of theater before. Justice turned into spectacle, truth drowned out by the sound of coins and cowardice. He stepped forward, pointing a finger at Boone. You forged those. You made her sign something she couldn't read. You think hiding behind ink makes it right? Boone's smile widened. Careful? Sheriff? Your friend here sounds an awful lot like he's threatening me. Eli took another step. His voice rose. Thunder in a small room. You don't get to own people. Boone didn't flinch. Maybe not. But the law says I own that paper. And in this town, that's enough. The words hit harder than any punch. Eli's hands clenched at his sides, shaking. He saw flashes of dirt street, a gun in his hand, a boy falling, the weight of failure pressing in from every side. He heard Mara's breath hitch behind him. Before he knew it, his hand had grabbed Boone's collar, dragging him halfway across the desk. You son of a, Eli Greeley's shout cracked through the room. 2 deputies rushed in, pulling them apart. Eli's hat hit the floor. Boone straightened his vest, unruffled but smirking. See? Boone said calmly, violent, unstable, just like the stories said. Mira pressed herself against the wall, eyes wide. Eli struggled in the deputy's grip, chest heaving. Greeley stepped forward, face pale. That's enough. Both of you. He looked at Eli, his old friend, the man he once trusted more than any. You're making this worse. Eli stopped fighting. The deputies released him slowly. He stooped, picked up his hat, dusted it off, and set it back on his head. Boone adjusted his cufflinks, every motion dripping with smug victory. I'll expect the law to act properly, Boone said. I'm filing charges against both of them: theft, fraud, assault. Let's see if the truth still means something in Silverton. He tipped his hat again, that same lazy charm as he turned for the door. The crowd outside parted, murmuring approval. Eli stood silent, fists at his sides, while Greeley sank into his chair like a man already defeated. When the noise faded and Boone's shadow was gone, Mara spoke barely more than a whisper. They'll destroy you too, she said. Eli looked at her, the fire of rage cooling into something heavier. Then let 'em try. Outside, the sun dipped behind the hills, leaving Silverton Hollow in the kind of half-light that made it hard to tell which way the truth was leaning anymore. The cell door clanged shut with a finality that echoed through Eli Harrow's bones. Sheriff Greeley didn't meet his eyes when he turned the key. Disturbing the peace, he said quietly. It was an old phrase, a safe one. It meant we don't know what to do with you, so we'll lock you up and pray it settles itself. Eli didn't argue. He just sat down on the narrow cot, hat in his lap, hands resting heavy on his knees. The bars cast long shadows across the wall, lines like a cage drawn by regret. He'd been in jails before on the other side of the door, holding the keys instead of wearing the guilt. But this felt right somehow, like the end of a circle he'd been walking since the day he pulled that trigger 6 years ago. He leaned back against the cold brick, closed his eyes. The air smelled of rust and rain. Outside, thunder rolled over Silverton Hollow, the first drops tapping at the roof in slow rhythm, the same rhythm he'd heard the night she came to his door. He thought of Mara, of the look on her face when they dragged him away. Not fear, not pity, but something deeper. A sorrow that said she'd seen too many good men swallowed by bad systems. He wondered where she was now. Safe, maybe, or pretending to be. Greeley's footsteps faded down the hall. The station went quiet except for the rain. Eli spoke softly into the dark, voice rough and low. You really outdid yourself this time, Harrow. He gave a humorless laugh. Could have kept your head down, could have let it go. But no, you had to play hero again. He looked at his hands still swollen from gripping Boone's collar, still shaking from rage. They were the same hands that had drawn too fast once, that had ended a boy's life in a back alley in Santa Fe. He could still see it, clear the flash, the fall, the silence that followed, the mother's cry, the badge growing heavier by the second, until he couldn't wear it anymore. Now here he was, older, slower, but still just as clumsy with redemption. Maybe, he thought, he wasn't built to save anything. Maybe all he did was break what was already fragile. He tilted his head back, stared at the ceiling. A trickle of water ran down the wall from a leak in the corner. Glinting each time, lightning flashed through the window. He counted the seconds between thunder and flash. Old habit from long nights on the range. It gave him rhythm. It made the loneliness feel measured. After a while, he spoke again, softer this time, almost a prayer. I didn't mean for it to go that way. Any of it. Not with the boy. Not with her. His voice cracked on the last word. He swallowed hard, wiped a hand over his face. You'd think a man learns from his ghosts. The rain deepened, steady and cold. He listened to it beat against the windows. The same pulse that had brought Mara to his porch that first night. There was a strange comfort in the sound, like the land reminding him that even storms had rhythm, even ruin had a kind of grace. He thought about what Greeley had said before closing the door. Let me sort this out. Eli, don't make it worse. But how do you sort out a lie that's been written to look like truth? How do you fight a man who buys the silence of every witness? He'd seen this story before too many times. And every time, the ending was the same, the poor buried, the rich forgiven, the law pretending not to notice. Eli sighed, low and tired. Maybe it's better this way, he muttered. Better me in here than her. He shifted, the cot creaking beneath him. His hat fell to the floor. For a while, he just sat there listening to the rain slow, even endless. Then, without quite meaning to, he whispered her name. Mara. The word left his lips like a secret carried on wind. He didn't expect it to reach her, but somehow he hoped it would. Across town, the rain found her too. Mara sat on the edge of the narrow hotel bed, the room dim and cold. A single lamp burned low beside her. She hadn't taken off her shawl, hadn't touched the food left on the tray by the door. In her lap, she clutched the faded blue blanket Eli had given her, his mother's blanket. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and safety. She'd prayed once before, that way holding something that wasn't hers, but felt like mercy. Now she did it again. Her fingers twisted the fabric as her lips moved soundlessly. She didn't pray for herself. She prayed for the man sitting alone in a cell because he'd believed her. Through the window, she could see the sheriff's office light burning across the square. She imagined him there, back straight, eyes distant, rain dripping from the bars. He didn't belong behind iron. Neither of them did. But the world had never cared much about belonging. She thought of Boone, the smile, the forged papers, the way he looked at her like she was already defeated. Her hands tightened around the blanket until her knuckles whitened. She wasn't that woman anymore. Eli had shown her what real strength looked like: quiet, scarred, stubborn. She wouldn't let his name drown the way hers almost had. The storm outside grew heavier, wind pressing against the shutters like a warning. Lightning flared, lighting the room for a single breath. In that flash, her reflection in the mirror startled her pale, fierce, alive. She didn't recognize the woman looking back, but she didn't fear her either. She closed her eyes and whispered his name into the sound of the rain. Eli. The syllables trembled in the air, soft as prayer, strong as promise. And though the town slept, the storm carried their voices between two rooms, one cell, one bed, weaving them together across the distance like a hymn only the night could hear. Back in the jail, Eli stirred, as if hearing something through the storm. A faint warmth moved through him, not comfort, not hope exactly, but the sense of not being alone in the world. He drew a slow breath, let it out. Then, almost against his will, he smiled, the first real one in years. The rain kept falling, washing over Silverton Hollow, cleansing nothing but reminding everything it touched that it was still alive. And somewhere between the cracks of thunder, two names, a man's and a woman's, drifted across the dark, trying to find each other again. By late afternoon, Silverton Hollow was burning with rumor. Not fire, not yet, but words hot enough to scorch the truth. It started in the saloon, where Boone bought the first round and told his story just loud enough for everyone to hear. He said Eli Harrow had snapped, said the ex-lawman had attacked him without cause, that one of Boone's men had gone missing after the scuffle. He was seen bleeding behind the livery. Boone said, hand pressed to his heart, "Poor Jed Cutter. Don't think he's breathin' no more." By the time the whiskey hit the tables, the story had grown teeth. By sundown, it had claws. And by the time the lamps were lit along Main Street, half the town believed Eli Harrow was a killer again. Boone stood outside the saloon, coat buttoned, voice smooth as silk and poison. "Men like Harrow," he said to the crowd. "They don't change. He's a danger to this town, to your wives, to your children. We can't wait for the sheriff to decide what's right, not when a murderer's sitting in our jail." Someone shouted, "Where's Greeley?" Another answered, "Probably hiding in his office, same as always." The crowd laughed, bitter and tight. Boone raised his hands. The preacher of his own gospel, "I say we finish what the law won't." A cheer rose, not loud, but hungry, the kind that comes from fear pretending to be courage. Men began fetching lanterns, rifles, pitchforks. The sound of boots and glass and anger filled the street like thunder on the ground. Sheriff Tom Greeley watched it all from the doorway of his office. His hand hovered over his badge, fingers twitching. He'd worn that star for 20 years, believed in it, once believed it meant something. Now it just felt like a weight pulling him under. He saw Boone's men lighting torches, their faces bright with the reflection of fire. Saw townsfolk he'd known since they were children, good people letting rage do their thinking. He muttered under his breath, "Damn you." Silas. Then he turned toward the cells. Eli looked up when the door opened. "What's happening out there?" Greeley hesitated, jaw working. "Boone's got the town riled. Says you killed his man." Eli's eyes narrowed. "Jed Cutter." "That's the one. Jed's not dead." "I know," Greeley said quietly. "But truth don't travel as fast as fire." Eli stood, hands gripping the bars. "You gonna open this door? Tom, I can't." "You won't," Eli said. The sheriff stepped closer, voice low. "I've got orders to keep you safe until I can sort this mess out. If I let you out now, they'll string you up before the truth gets a word in." Eli's gaze didn't waver. "Tom, they're coming, whether that door's locked or not." Outside, the noise was growing, the sound of boots in unison, the cry of someone shouting Eli's name like a curse. Greeley turned toward the window, watched the flicker of torches begin to move up the street. The heat from the crowd reached even here, a fever spreading through the night. He thought of the last time he'd seen this years ago. Another mob, another man accused. He'd stood aside then too, let fear call itself justice. That night still haunted him, and now history was knocking again. He turned back to Eli. "I'll do what I can," he said softly. "Do more," Eli replied. Their eyes met, two men, bound by a past. Neither could escape. Greeley looked away first. He turned the key halfway in the lock, then stopped. "I can't lose this badge," he whispered. Eli's voice came like gravel. "Then you'll lose your soul instead." Across town, Mara Ellison was already moving. She'd heard the shouts from her hotel window, first laughter, then anger, then words that froze her blood. "They're going for the jail," someone said outside. "Boone says Harrow killed a man." She didn't stop to think. She pulled on her boots, wrapped the blue blanket around her shoulders, like armor, and slipped out the back door. The rain had started again. Thin, cold, relentless. It soaked her hair, her dress, her fear. She ran through alleys, past the blacksmiths, past the livery, heart hammering like hooves in her chest. Torches glowed ahead, firelight bouncing off puddles and windows. Men's voices rose and fell, curses, accusations, lies dressed as scripture. She could smell the pitch and smoke. Her stomach turned at the sound of Boone's voice above the rest. "He's a murderer," Boone cried. "You think the law will stop him next time?" "No, we stop him tonight." The crowd roared in answer. Rain hissed on the flames, turning them to steam, but it didn't matter. The heat came from the people now. Mara slipped through the shadows behind the mercantile, staying low. Her shoes slipped in the mud, but she didn't stop until she reached the side door of the sheriff's office. She pushed it open, breath ragged. "Eli," she whispered, "they're coming for you." He rose from the cot, face calm but eyes sharp. "I know," he said. She ran to the bars, gripping them. "I won't let them take you." He shook his head. "You shouldn't be here." Outside. The roar grew louder, boots pounded, a bottle shattered against the wall glass, and fire bursting for an instant before the rain killed it. Greeley burst back into the room, rifle in hand. "They're 2 blocks away," he said. He looked at Mara, panic flashing in his eyes. "Get her out of here, Eli." Eli stepped closer to the bars. "You gonna open it this time?" "Tom." The sheriff hesitated again, torn between fear of the mob and faith in the man behind the steel. Outside, someone shouted, "Burn the place down." That broke him. He unlocked the cell. "Go," he said. Eli stepped out, grabbed his hat, and turned to Mara. "Stay behind me." They barely made it to the back hallway before the first rock hit the window. The glass shattered, spraying across the floor like ice. Voices screamed from outside, men Eli had known, men he'd once protected. Now their faces twisted in torchlight, drunk on anger. "Bring him out. Let justice be done," Greeley shouted from the doorway. "This is my town. You'll stand down or answer to me." But his words drowned in the sound of fire and rain. Eli pushed Mara toward the back door, eyes scanning for escape. "Where's Bramble?" "At the livery." Another crash, louder this time. The front window exploded, fire spilling inside. Greeley turned, raising his rifle. Eli shouted, "Don't!" Then the first shot rang out. The sound cracked through the storm like lightning turned to metal. And just like that, Silverton Hollow crossed a line it couldn't come back from. The first shot split the night like a scream. Then came the answering roar gunfire, shouting, boots pounding through mud. The storm that had been brewing in Silverton Hollow finally broke. And this time it wasn't rain that fell. Eli Harrow hit the floor as glass rained down. Mara crouched behind the overturned table, arms over her head. Smoke curled through the broken window torchlight, and fury mixed into one choking haze. Outside, the mob howled like wild dogs. "Bring 'em out. Burn it all." Sheriff Greeley fired once into the air. "Stop. There's women inside." But reason was already gone. Fear had taken its place. Another bullet tore through the doorframe. Wood splintered inches from Eli's shoulder. He looked at Greeley. "We can't hold 'em." "And hold." The sheriff nodded grimly. Back way out, they pushed through the hallway, smoke thick, heat rising. At the rear door, Eli shoved it open, dragging Mara into the rain. The sky flashed white, thunder rolling over the rooftops like artillery. He turned toward the stables, but Boone's men were already there, blocking the way. Rifles gleaming wet in the lamplight. Boone himself stood at the center of the street, coat soaked, hat pulled low, a pistol gleaming in each hand. Behind him, the townsfolk held their torches, high faces twisted by shadow and flame. "Evening," Harrow Boone called, voice carrying clear over the storm. "Looks like you finally made yourself the villain they all thought you were." Eli stepped forward, the rain dripping off his brim, his voice steady. "You started this. Boone. You lied. You forged. You broke her." Boone laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "She broke herself. Always does. When people forget their place." He turned, grabbed Mara by the arm, yanking her into the open. The crowd gasped. Boone pressed the muzzle of his gun to her temple. "Funny thing, lawmen," he said. "They always come running when a woman cries. You're no different." Eli froze. "Mara," he said quietly, "don't move." Her eyes met his, no fear now, only trust. The rain fell harder, drumming on the roofs, soaking them both. Boone's smile didn't waver. "You can't save her. Harrow, you couldn't save that boy either." For a heartbeat, the world stopped breathing. Eli's jaw tightened. The memory hit the flash, the boy's body in the dust. The years of silence that followed, every ounce of guilt, every sleepless night, every whisper of failure boiled up and found its mark in Boone's voice. Eli lifted his head, eyes cold. "No," he said, "but I can stop you." Boone's grin faltered. Lightning cracked, blinding white. In that moment, Eli moved. His hand went to the Colt at his hip. Smooth, practiced, inevitable. The first shot ripped through the rain, followed by another and another. The sound echoed off the buildings like thunder trapped in a canyon. Boone stumbled back, still clutching Mara. He fired wild, his bullet grazing Eli's shoulder. The force spun Eli sideways, pain flaring hot and deep. He dropped to one knee, teeth clenched, but kept his gun steady. Mara twisted free, fell to the mud. Boone turned toward her again, and that was his mistake. Eli fired once more. The shot struck true. Boone's body arched, then folded, the torchlight catching his face as he fell into the street. For a moment, nobody moved. The rain hissed on the flames, turning the air to steam. The mob's roar faltered. What had been fury became silence, thick and heavy. All eyes turned to the fallen man, sprawled in the mud like the truth itself laid bare. Eli rose slowly, pressing a hand to the wound in his shoulder. Blood ran down his arm, mixing with rain. He walked toward Boone's body, each step a struggle. When he reached him, he holstered his gun and stared down. Boone's eyes were still open, fixed on nothing. Eli knelt beside him. "You built your kingdom on fear," he said softly. "Now look what it bought you." He reached out, took the gun from Boone's limp hand, and dropped it into the mud. Behind him, the sheriff and a few men from the crowd moved closer, their torches flickering uncertainly. No one spoke. Mara rose to her feet, the blue blanket still clutched around her shoulders, her face streaked with rain and ash. She looked at Eli bloodied, steady, unbroken. He looked back, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "Guess that makes us even," he said, voice rasping. Greeley approached, hat in hand. "My God." Eli swayed a little but stayed upright. "Keep your God." "Tom, just tell them what happened here." "What do I tell them?" the sheriff asked quietly. Eli looked at the townsfolk faces he'd once known, faces that had condemned him without question. He took a breath that rattled in his chest and spoke slowly, every word deliberate. "Tell them she wasn't property. Tell them she was free." The rain began to ease. Smoke curled into the sky from a half-burned torch lying in the street. No one could remember who dropped it first. Then another followed, and another. The firelight died one ember at a time until the street was lit only by the pale gray of dawn. Eli stumbled once, catching himself against the rail. Mara ran to him, her hand gentle on his arm. He winced but didn't pull away. "You're hurt," she whispered. He smiled faintly. Been hurt before, behind them. Greeley barked orders, rounding up the men who'd followed Boone. The mob was gone now, replaced by shame and silence. Rainwater carried the blood away, down the gutters, out toward the open fields, where it would vanish, like everything else the land couldn't hold. Eli looked once more at the body in the mud, then at Mara beside him. The pain in his shoulder pulsed, steady as his heartbeat, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like purpose. The storm of men had passed. What remained was the truth, battered, scarred, but standing. Morning came to Silverton Hollow, not with birdsong, but with silence. A thin fog rolled through the valley, soft as smoke, curling between the buildings that still smelled of gunpowder and rain. The street was slick with mud and memory. The town, so loud the night before, now stood still, listening to the echo of what it had done. Sheriff Tom Greeley walked down the main road, boots squelching in the wet dirt. He held his hat low against the drizzle. Here and there, townsfolk peered from windows, ashamed, uncertain, still afraid of what the light might show. The torches were gone, burned out, the mob had gone home. But the truth stayed behind. He stopped where Silas Boone had fallen. The body was gone, taken to the undertaker's. But the stain remained a dark mark in the street that rain couldn't wash away. Greeley stood there a long while, then turned toward the livery. He found Mara there, kneeling beside Eli Harrow. She'd made a bed of hay and old blankets, the blue one draped over him. He was pale, breathing shallow, blood seeping through the bandage on his shoulder. Her hands moved gently, steady even as her eyes shimmered. "Morning, Sheriff," she whispered without looking up. Her voice was small, but clear. "I couldn't move him far. Bullets still in." Greeley knelt beside them, hat pressed to his chest. "How bad?" Mara shook her head. "Bad enough." Eli stirred, eyelids fluttering. "Still here," he muttered, his voice a rasp. "Don't start burying me yet." A faint smile tugged at Mara's lips. She brushed his forehead, the gesture tender and trembling. "You shouldn't talk. Never was good at doing what I should," he said, and tried to grin, but it came out a wince. Greeley exhaled. "You're lucky to be breathing. Luck had nothing to do with it," Eli murmured. "Just bad aim." He coughed once, the sound harsh, but his eyes found the sheriff's. "Boone dead," Greeley said. "You made sure of that." Eli's head sank back. "Then it's done." Greeley shook his head, slowly. "Not yet." He stood, walked toward the wagon parked under the eaves of the livery. It had Boone's mark painted on the side, gold letters dulled by rain. The rear door hung open. Inside, crates were stacked neatly, freight manifests, ledgers, and boxes labeled company property. But when Greeley pried one open, he froze. Inside were papers, real ones, contracts, with names, dates, and marks, dozens of them. Dozens of people Boone had bought and sold under false debts. Men and women listed like inventory. He set the papers down, jaw tight. Son of a bitch, he whispered. He pulled another box, found more forged records, receipts signed by witnesses who never existed. Proof undeniable, ugly, and heavy as sin. Mara had come up behind him, her hand covering her mouth. "That's what he did to us," she said softly. "To all of us." Greeley turned, his voice low and certain. "He's not taking another soul with him." He gathered the papers into a bundle, tied them with a strip of rope, and looked out at the town. People were stepping into the street now, faces washed clean by guilt and rain. They looked toward the livery, toward the sheriff, waiting for someone to tell them what came next. Greeley raised his voice, steady as a sermon. Silas Boone built his empire on lies, on forged contracts, on fear. These papers prove it. Every man and woman he claimed to own, every debt he made up. It's done. It's over. The crowd murmured, uneasy. He turned, gestured toward the doorway where Mara stood beside Eli. "You all followed a liar last night. You let him tell you who the villain was. But the man bleeding in that stall is the one who saved this town from itself." A hush fell. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to stop listening. Greeley looked back at Eli, his voice gentler now. "You gave them back their conscience, Eli. Might not sound like much, but around here, that's more than law." Eli smiled faintly, eyes half open. "That right. That's right." For a long moment, the three of them stood in silence, lawman, woman, and ghost of a hero who'd finally stopped running. Outside, the fog began to thin. Sunlight pushed through, pale and soft, touching the rooftops with gold. Mara knelt beside him again, her hand resting over his. "Stay with me," she whispered. Eli turned his head toward her, eyes distant but calm. "You got your freedom now," he murmured. "You hold on to it." She shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I don't want freedom without you." He smiled a tired, grateful smile that reached his eyes. "That's not how it works, Mara. Freedom's what you do alone. Once someone else's fight gives it back to you." She pressed his hand to her heart. The sheriff turned away, eyes glistening. He walked to the barn door, watching the fog lift off the hills. Behind him, Eli's breathing slowed, each rise of his chest shallower than the last. Mara's quiet sob filled the small space, blending with the wind. The sheriff spoke softly, as if to the morning itself. "Lord, give this man peace. He's earned it." A beam of sunlight slipped through a break in the clouds, warm and golden, landing across Eli's face. He turned his head slightly toward it, as if he could still feel the dawn. His eyes fluttered once, then closed. Mara's hand tightened around his. "Eli," she whispered. He didn't answer, but the faintest smile lingered on his lips. Caught in that first touch of sun, outside, the sheriff looked up. The fog was gone. Smoke drifted thin from the rooftops, rising straight into the clear blue sky. Somewhere a church bell began to ring slow, steady, forgiving. And for the first time in years, Silverton Hollow felt clean. Spring came soft that year, as if the land itself was tired of thunder. The hills around Silver Creek turned green again, and the air smelled of lilac and river stone. Grass pushed through the ash the fire had left behind, and the wind carried birdsong instead of sirens. Out by the old Harrow place, a single figure walked the fence line, slow and sure. Eli Harrow still moved like a man stitched together from stubbornness and scars. His right shoulder stayed stiff, where the bullet had passed clean through, but his hands were steady now. He worked the post-hole digger with the patience of someone who had learned that time, when used, right, could heal almost anything. He paused often, leaning on the shovel, listening to the creek that wound below the ridge. It made the same sound it always had, water over stone, never hurrying, never stopping. Sometimes he thought that sound had kept him alive those long months when the fever came and the nights stretched thin. Other times he figured it was her. From where he stood, he could see the white-painted roof of the new schoolhouse 2 miles down the valley. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin gray line. Children's laughter drifted faintly on the breeze light, careless, alive. That's where Mara Ellison spent her days now, teaching the ranch hands' kids their letters, giving them the kind of learning that could outlast a plow, She had rebuilt her life plank by plank, just the way she'd helped rebuild his fence. Every morning, she rang the brass bell that hung above the door. And every evening, she left a lantern burning on the porch, a soft circle of light in the dark. The townsfolk called it the teacher's beacon. They said it was for travelers on the road, so they'd know there was still kindness in Silverton Hollow. But those who knew her better understood it was for him. For the man up on the ridge who still looked toward that glow before he turned in for the night. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, an old preacher came riding up the trail, a man named Hank Dyer. He'd buried Boone, baptized half the town, and seen enough sin to know redemption when it finally showed its face. He liked to sit on Eli's porch, boots crossed, pipe between his teeth, talking in that slow, cracked voice of his. I reckon you surprised the Almighty. Eli. Hank said, one dusk, watching the sun fold itself behind the hills. Eli chuckled. Didn't mean to. Few folks do. But you gave this town back something it lost, made 'em look one another in the eye again. That's no small miracle. Eli said nothing for a while. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed one over. Steam rose, carrying the scent of burnt beans and new hope. I just did what needed doing, he said at last. Hank nodded. That's what the good book calls faith. Son. They sat in silence, listening to the night settle, down below. The lantern on Mara's porch flickered against the dark, steady as a heartbeat. Fireflies gathered near it, drawn by the same promise. Hank told the story often in the years that followed. He'd start it slow, his voice soft as wind through cottonwood leaves. Now some folks say he died that night. He'd begin, and maybe a part of him did. But the rest, well, the rest lived, barely. He'd puff on his pipe, watching the smoke curl like memory. The town changed after that. People started talking different, started walking different. They built a new jail with windows, not bars. The saloon started closing early on Sundays. And every spring, someone put wildflowers on the patch of ground where the fire burned hottest. No marker, no name, just forgiveness growing wild. He'd pause there, eyes half closed. Eli Harrow. He kept to his land, fixed fences, tended horses, spoke little, but he smiled more. And the woman Mara Ellison, she taught the children how to read and the grown men how to listen. Between the two of them, they taught Silverton how to breathe again. One evening, after the preacher had gone, Eli walked down to the creek. The sun hung low, turning the water to molten gold. He stooped, picked up a smooth stone, and turned it over in his palm. The surface was cold, but the weight felt good, real. He thought of the boy he'd shot all those years ago, the one who still haunted his dreams. He thought of Boone, and how power had twisted a man beyond mercy. Then he thought of Mara's laughter, of the way her voice softened when she said his name. Somewhere between those thoughts, he found peace. He tossed the stone into the water. It vanished with a single ripple that widened, then disappeared. The sound of it faded into the steady murmur of the creek, as if the earth itself was saying, "Enough." That night, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. Eli sat on his porch, the old blue blanket folded beside him. He could see the lantern glowing down the valley warm, patient, unwavering. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, gone gray, and let out a long, quiet breath. He wasn't lonely anymore. The world still hurt sometimes, but it hurt in ways that meant living. He could feel it in the creak of the porch boards, in the scent of rain coming down the river, in the faint echo of children's laughter carried on the wind, life, imperfect and good. He leaned back in his chair, watching the horizon fade from gold to blue to soft black. Crickets started their chorus, the kind of music that fills the gaps where words fall short. He thought of what Hank had said earlier that week. Redemption don't always roar, the preacher told him. Sometimes it just hums along quiet, like a tune God forgot to finish. Eli smiled at that. He looked again at the lantern, burning steady in the dark. Somewhere down there, Mara would be closing the schoolhouse door, setting out her lessons for tomorrow, maybe humming that same tune under her breath. The stars began to show, one by one. He raised his cup toward that small, steadfast light. "Good night, teacher," he murmured. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of lilac and wood smoke, and the whisper of the creek below. In the story of Eli Harrow and Mara Ellison, we find something larger than the dust and gunfire. We find the quiet truth that redemption rarely shouts. It doesn't come with applause or headlines. It comes when a broken man decides to stand again, when a frightened woman dares to speak the truth, and when an entire town finally looks its own shame in the eye. Life will hand us storms, some outside, many within, and sometimes doing what's right won't make us heroes. It'll just make us human. But that's enough. Eli's story reminds us that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the hardest kind of courage, that even when the world turns cruel, one act of decency can change its direction, and that love the quiet, steadfast kind is the lantern we leave burning for others to find their way home. So maybe, in our own small corners of the world, we can do the same. Keep the porch light on, hold out a little kindness, and remember, sometimes salvation doesn't roar, it simply waits, patient and bright in the dark. Thank you, friend, for riding with us through the dust and the dawn, for listening to a story not just about the West, but about the human heart. If Eli's journey touched you, if Mara's courage reminded you of someone you love, then help us keep these stories alive. Tap like to let us know you were here, share this tale so another soul might find its light, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes, where every week another forgotten story finds its voice again beneath the open sky. Until next time, keep your lanterns burning and your hearts kind.